Hello everyone, I'm Riya Gandhi and welcome back to my channel. As promised, I am back with yet another video on one of the most important questions that was asked in this year's UGC NET English exam. I've already made a video on 5 most unexpected terms that were asked in this year's paper. So if you haven't watched it out yet, please go watch it right now. In this video, we are going to talk about one of the most important schools of poetry. That school of poetry which is often overlooked, which is often overshadowed by the Modernist school of poetry, by the high modernists like T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound. We all know them, but do we know the Georgian School of Poetry? Georgian School of Poetry is an extremely important school of poetry, a loosely connected group of the 20th century poets, and they had a very significant part to play in shaping British literature, specifically British poetry. How? Because these Georgians, they basically helped in bridging the gap between Victorian literature and Modernist literature. They acquired a very small yet significant space there. In fact, so significant that they were asked in this year's paper. So without any further ado, let's focus on Georgian School of Poetry, understand their historical context, their origins, features, and uncover 5 of the most important Georgian poets so that next time in any paper of UGC NET English, if a question is asked of Georgian poetry, you are well prepared. So let us first understand the historical context and the origins of the Georgian School of Poetry. So as I've mentioned previously as well, the Georgian School of Poetry basically refers to this group of poets that emerged in the early 20th century, somewhere between 1910 or 12 to 1922. Especially during the reign of King George V. That is why these poets are called as Georgians, and this school of poetry is called as the Georgian School of Poetry. Having said that, now understand how this trend came out to be in this particular decade. So the thing was that during this particular point, a series of 5 anthologies were published between 1911 and 1922 by Harold Edward Munro, and then they were later edited by Edward Marsh. Now this term of Georgian School of Poetry was basically given to them, definitely as I've mentioned, because of the reign of George V, but this was also the time that a new shift was observed in the poetry that was written. Right? Because if you remember, before 1900s, you had the Victorian age, right? So the Victorian poetry or the Victorian literature was more grandiose in the sense that it was dealing with the social conventions, the social flattery and hypocrisy and all of those things. And then the 1920s and the 1930s was the period of high modernism, dominated by poets like T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, who majorly talked about fragmentation, experimentation, making poetry very elitist in nature, very exclusive in nature, right? So that you see that the Victorian poetry and the modernist poetry, they are on like the two extremes. Right? So how does Georgian School of Poetry bridge the gap? How is it a middle point between Victorian convention of poetry and the modernist convention of poetry? So when you're talking about some of the most important features of Georgian poetry, then definitely there would be a lot of nature imagery, as I've mentioned previously as well, going back to the romantic landscapes and the romantic themes of nature, right? So there is definitely nature imagery present over here. Yes, romantic nostalgia is also present there. They want to go back to the romantic age, try to capture their voice, the simplicity of it, the imagination of it, right? The innocence of it as well. They use a very simple language, did it in a pastoral settings. The background was pastoral settings. So pastoral basically means rural, signifying more simplicity, more innocence, away from the hustle and bustle of the city life and all of those things, right? So there is a lot of focus on emotion, beauty, introspection, personal reflection, right? And instead of focusing on very much decorated thoughts and showcasing them to be very classicist in nature or elitist in nature, which the modernists did up to some point, the Georgians weren't really bothered by that. They just wanted to be themselves, showcase their authenticity, right? And that is what differentiates Georgian poetry from Victorian as well as modernist poetry, very much similar to the romantic poetry. But what differentiates Georgian poetry from romantic poetry is the context. It's very much important to understand the context in which the Georgian poets were writing in. Right, so when you talk about the romantic poets, they enjoyed a fairly, or you can say comparatively, stable period. Whereas when you're talking about the Georgian School of Poetry, especially the decade that I mentioned to you from 1912 to 1922 was the period of the First World War. Because of the First World War, there was the rise of modernism, a lot of experimental forms, realism, which made Georgians look very old-fashioned in nature. So despite all of this, understand that Georgian poetry played a very, very significant role in shaping British poetry, in transitioning English poetry from the Victorian style, from the very ornate, from the very decorative Victorian style of writing poetry to something more grounded, something more emotionally, you can say, resonant, right? It died because of the First World War, which paved the way for the high modernist poetry to take its roots. Right, now having said that, let's understand 5 of the most important Georgian poets that you should know, especially for your UGC NET English exam. The first most important poet that we are going to discuss in this video is Rupert Brooke. Brooke is considered to be one of the most famous Georgian poets, sometimes also called as the golden boy of Georgian poetry. But I'm not sure about that title yet. Right, so Rupert Brooke is known for adding a lot of spiritual imagery in his poets. He is primarily considered to be a war poet, right, because of his idealistic war sonnets that he wrote during the First World War. His poetry sort of glorified war, the way he has written it, right, and because he died at a very young age in the war, he became a symbol of, sacrifice, what you can call as the youthful sacrifice. One of his most important poems is The Soldier, which I would like to read just a few of its lines, which are very, very famous, right? They are, "If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England." Right, so based on these lines, you can definitely understand that the kind of nationalistic zeal and the kind of dedication that he had, right, and the way that he talked about it in his poems is very, very iconic. Right, so these are some of the quick facts that you need to know about Rupert Brooke. And having said that, now let's move on to the next most important poet, which is Walter de la Mare. Right, so Walter de la Mare is very different in his poetic style. He's known for writing very mystical, very dream-like poetry, right? Talking about the supernatural themes, about memory, intriguing children especially rather than the adults. One of his most important poems that you should know is The Listeners. Right, in this particular poem, he has tried to bring out the supernatural from the natural, blending a lot of mystery as well as simplicity. That again takes us back to the concept or to the period of romantic literature, wherein you had poets like Samuel Taylor Coleridge who tried to bring out the supernatural from the natural, right, in poems like The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. So that just proves the fact again and again, reinforces the fact that Georgian poetry was so much similar to the romantic poetry and the romantic age. Having said that, now let's move on to the next most important Georgian poet, and that is Edward Thomas. Edward Thomas talked more about isolation. His poems basically dealt with personal reflection, talking about more personal and unsettling themes, in the sense that they talked a lot about maybe loneliness, that kind of isolation that people face. So it's not to say that Edward Thomas didn't talk about nature or didn't talk about emotion and beauty and love for nature. He did, but primarily his poems are more complex, right? They are more introspective. They reflect on his personal emotions, his personal feelings, talking about identity, isolation, human experiences. So you can say that Edward Thomas, in a way, also paved the way for the modernist poets to flourish, for the modernist poets to bloom, because modernist poetry essentially talks about all of these things, right? And all of these themes and poems, they were also influenced by his friendship, by his relationship with Robert Frost. Some of his most important poems include Addlestrop, The Rain, The Owl, As the Team's Head Brass, Lights Out, all of those things. And he was killed on 9th April 1917 in the First World War, just like Rupert Brooke. Having said that, now let's move on to the next most important Georgian poet, and that is James Elroy Flecker. Now, James Elroy Flecker, similar to the poet that we just discussed right now, was very different from the core Georgian poets, right? So he was known for his pastoral, nature-inspired poetry, but Flecker sort of leaned more towards exotic, towards mystical, and even classical themes in his poetry, right? Talking more about Orientalism, right? So his poetry was very much rich in symbolism. He had included a lot of symbols in his poetry, imagery in his poetry, Eastern landscapes, themes and cultures, and sort of made it very, very different from other Georgian poets during that point of time, right? One of his most important works is The Golden Journey to Samarkand, right? It's a lyrical poem that talks about mysticism and going in this quest of the unknown, right? Remains one of the most important poems in the anthologies. Remember the 5 series of published anthologies that we discussed about Georgian poetry? Yes, then James Flecker and his poems were often featured in these anthologies from time to time. Apart from The Golden Journey to Samarkand, he is known for The Old Ships and Hassan. By the names of these poems itself, you can recognize that he was very much influenced by the East, by the Oriental, by the exotic, something that started happening in the Romantic age itself. Right? So he had a lot of influences from the decadent movement to the Eastern influences, which sort of shaped his poetry and made it again very Georgian in nature. Having said that, now let's move on to the 5th most important Georgian poet in English literature, and that is John Drinkwater. When we are talking about John Drinkwater, he was not just an English poet, he was a playwright, he was a critic, and yes, very influential during the Georgian movement or during the 1911 and the 1920s, right? He co-founded the Pilgrim Players, which sort of later developed into a theatre company and had a very strong presence in literary circles, which means that he was a very influential figure during this point of time. Talking about his verses, talking about his poems, they were more, again, very pastoral in nature. They wanted to talk about the simplicity of living. He captured more the sensory details. So the previous poets we discussed that they focused more on symbolism, more on imagery, more on metaphors. Here you see the focus and the emphasis is more on the sensory details, right? So up to some point you can say that Drinkwater's poems are considered to be an example, are considered to be exemplary of pastoral Georgian verses or pastoral Georgian poetry, right? Because understand that Drinkwater's poems were featured in all the 5 anthologies, right? Which says a lot about his poetic style and how he also played a very, very influential role in shaping the Georgian poetry and the characteristics of Georgian poetry, right? Apart from, so one of his most important poems is the Moonlit Apples, right? Apart from that, you have Poems, which is a collection from 1908 to 1914, and his play Abraham Lincoln, right? So these are the 5 most important Georgian poets whom you should remember and whom you should keep in mind for your next UGC NET English exam. With this, we now come to an end of our video. Understand that the Georgian poets, they sort of stand at crossroads in British literature, especially in the sense that they weren't so decorative or they weren't so ornate as the Victorians, nor were they so bold, nor were they so exclusive like the Modernists. But what they gave was the poetry of transition, right? The poetry of different kind of beauty, a poetry that takes us back to the Romantic age in literature, but definitely with a different context, with a different theme, with a different time period, right? Trying to take us back to the pre-war innocence. Right? So for UGC NET English, understanding the Georgian School of Poetry will definitely help you in understanding how British poetry sort of developed over the period of time. Right? How the response to war sort of began with this urge, with this force to take us back to pre-war innocence, but then later on it happened with the forceful acceptance of reality with the high modernists. Having said that, we now come to an end of our video. If you have any questions related to Georgian School of Poetry, British literature, or anything related to UGC NET English, you can let me know in the comments section below and I'll be very happy to help you. If you found this video informative and helpful, please like, share and subscribe to my channel for more such informative content in the future. And let me know in the comment section below which video or which topic, which concept related to literature would you like me to cover next. Okay, so thank you so much for watching till the end of this video. I'll see you in the next one.